retry counts, penalties, integrity fees. These are things that have things you can do about it. You may choose to still do things the way you're doing, but it's always worth taking a look and saying, you know what, I am paying 10,000. I mean, I had a merchant who was paying, they were paying $60,000 in integrity fees because of not submitting CVV when they could have. And so they were not qualifying for the best kind of processing. That's a huge tax on a business. So start there and then work your way from there.
In this episode, we sat with Albert Drouart from Pagos, and we talked about payments analytics, payments monitoring, payments benchmarking, AI in payments, and much, much more. So some specific question I ask is, why do I need external payments analytics tool if I can see all my insights and data right in my payment provider dashboard? Why I cannot build analytics dashboard myself by using Tableau or Looker internally? Do I really need payments analysis tools if I'm using just a single payment service provider and my data is not that complex? With this, please welcome Albert. Hi, Albert, and thank you for joining Payments FM.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Thank you. Excited as well. A lot of merchants and businesses use your platform to analyze their payments data, right? Maybe can you share like a specific example where analysis of this data revealed like a specific problem that merchant they had like no idea existed before this? So they like open the dashboard and they're like, oh wow, that's something is happening that we didn't even think about.
I think customers come into Pagos with different levels of maturity, and that drives how they're using the platform. But even as recently in the last few weeks, one of my favorite stories was that a digital subscription merchant was doing a migration between subscription platforms. And they were moving customers, moving business, and for a subscription platform, that's such an essential, that recurring monthly job is so essential. And what ended up happening is that as they were doing that migration, transaction volume fell quite a bit. And so when we have an alerting system, and we have, of course, visualizations around that, but they logged in and they actually saw the transaction volume had actually fallen. And that led to kind of investigating actually that the job and customers had not been properly turned on to auto renew, which was a setting on that system. The job that was worth quite a bit of money for them was not running smoothly. They were able to react, and even though it was something in the configuration for them, they were able to address that and actually collect the money that they were owed and trigger a bunch of downstream processes. So that's just one example of many. Companies are able to see things that otherwise they struggle, right?
Yeah, it's maybe a very interesting thought about this kind of like payments monitoring, right? Maybe a good place to ask, like, if on a payment side, when you're monitoring transactions, you can identify problems that are hidden beneath it, more foundational. Like if the website is down completely, that's something you can track when you're monitoring action.
I think for those of us, myself included, who have been in payments and either working with merchants or working on or supporting merchants or actually working with as a merchant, there's a difference, and that's something that's motivated us at Pagos. There's a difference between a technical outage, which is that your PSP is down, versus the actual business impact of a degradation in payments performance, which is probably more common. There is nothing native in most monitoring systems where payments is understood, where an approval rate is a thing or a decline code is a thing. It's usually that a system is either up or down. The way we alert is very much around how businesses think about payments. If there's changes in distributions of decline codes or spikes, if there's transaction volumes that degrade, those are the kinds of things we alert on and push out so that customers can kind of get the signal that they're actually looking for, not that their acquire is down, but that their business is being impacted. And I think we think we think about the problem holistically. I think we really take the merchant's perspective in the things we build. So it's always beyond just the transaction in a way. It's also about trying to help them understand the kind of journey. We have one customer who had a challenge where their logistics provider went down, not the payment system. The logistics provider went down. That actually impacted their payment processing, and they saw their transactions crater. Even though the PSP was up, it was because that dependency was not being met on the page, and that triggered all the downstream. Those are the kinds of things we try and do as part of kind of what we consider payments monitoring. It's more subtle than just the technical up and down signal.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that because payments are at the bottom of the funnel, you can identify a lot of other problems, like I don't know, like SMS notifications are not working or something like that, and you will see it like on the payments performance. Maybe like outside of this example, if you will kind of zoom out a little bit, what are typical maybe like categories of problems and issues payments analysis can identify?
I think it's a good question. I break down, I think because we think about the merchant's perspective and that payments is a piece in that funnel of getting a customer, I do believe that before a transaction happens, understanding the payment method itself and really as a proxy for the buyer, I think can be quite powerful. We've seen customers who, if you haven't been in payments for a long time, don't realize that like prepaid can be problematic for certain product types. Understanding the type of payment credential, the type of card pre-transaction can lead to tuning a checkout experience so that you're offering the right products and services to the right payment methods essentially. And then of course after the transaction, you want to kind of understand if you're dealing with churn or you're dealing with just real-time declines, what is happening. And that starts, of course, with the payment methods. And we think of it as kind of a tree. So you have, of course, the PSP, the transactions going to the brands, you have the card types, average order buckets, the different stored credentials, or whether it's recurring or one time. All these things influence performance. And so if you're thinking about revenue and you're thinking about those customer journeys, you really want to think about like where, depending on where they started in that journey, how are they paying, and is that matching? Is it performing? And of course, there's all the operations and risk and finance. So finance teams cost isn't very important. Payments is usually one of the biggest line items for a business after people. So there's finance teams and payment people tend to be very focused on cost and avoiding surprises and forecasting so that they can actually budget for those costs. And of course, there's the kind of risk operations, which is chargebacks and fraud rules, which are also always changing. And as the networks are changing rules with things like VAMP, of course, you have to adjust your process or the way you're counting. But those are, I think from front to back, is understanding customer all the way to understanding the actual transaction processing and the impact it has on the business.
If you like this episode, please subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcast. The best way to subscribe to Payments FM is go to payments.fm website and subscribe on the website. In this case, we'll be sure that you're not missing any new episodes. I have one more announcement to make. Now we're launching Payments Community Slack channel. This is the Slack channel where we are inviting payments professionals. If you are tired of the same payments diagrams, payments influencers, hype, and all over and over the same post about payments on LinkedIn, we'll be facilitating real, true conversations about challenges with payments and how to solve them. To join the waitlist, just to go to the payments.fm/Slack. Thank you so much, and back to the episode. Yeah, I'm curious about actually merchants' expectations before they implemented payment monitoring and deep analysis solutions. There could be two sides of the spectrum. Maybe some merchants, they're aware of the problem and they're like concerned and really need to look into the data and we need to have some reliable monitoring solution. There is another group who are more like, No, we're kind of fine. We like implemented payment provider a couple of years ago. It's working. And they're a little bit more optimistic about their performance and don't expect to see any underlying issues. Um, what do you usually see like from the from the merchant perspective? Are they really like optimistic about their data before they discover, look at the dashboard?
Yeah, I think the businesses have invested a lot in the infrastructure around their payments. Payments data itself tends to be a deep domain. And even if they're already tracking something, they often need help discovering more they can change. So I think what the way we think about it, and we've been very, very fortunate to work with some of the largest companies that are transacting both in card present and card not present. And I think they even with the investments they've made, even with the kind of optimism that you mentioned that they have, I think that there's always more to learn. We see that as our role to play, that we can kind of enrich their perspective, give them give make it even easier for them to use their data. And so then they're kind of surprised to find opportunities from there. I think the payments ecosystem has, and you don't have to build everything. So I think that's true across payment processing and fraud. Usually merchants bring those together, seeing where either the way those vendors are working together can be opportunities. Having the team and the experience to understand all the data can be a challenge. Enriching, that could be as simple as Pagos providing context around bins. We do that for many companies, kind of fraud companies, to transaction processing, but even for understanding where there's issues, having accurate bin data and making it usable can drive to a deeper understanding of, oh my goodness, this bank is actually penalizing us, even though all of their peers are not, right? It's something that even though you've collected all this data, you may not be able to get the answers. And then I think on the other side, which is common, is the merchants coming to us with a specific pain. We hear a lot from angel investors who have had the experience of having to build what Pagos has done. And they often come to the conclusion that it's quite painful to get to the point where you can make the data useful. And so getting that data, it can be fragmented, unreliable. And so they start getting excited on things that maybe feel more basic, but are actually hard as well, which is can we just get the data? Can the data be reliable? Can I count on it when I'm counting transactions? Is that the right number? Those are things that they get excited about. And then they're building on top of that for doing specific, research or projects of optimization.
Let's talk a little bit more about like the payment analysis itself. You mentioned the quality like of data and how hard it is to get, right? Like reliable data. What actually like specific problems you see about this? Because maybe on the surface it doesn't look that complex. You're using payment service provider, they have reporting or API you can just like download, right, and put it in your warehouse. Yeah. So it feels quite straightforward for people who probably didn't work on it that much. Are there any like hidden issues with this approach?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think whenever you start to push on performance, it starts to expose some of the challenges of kind of payments data. I think I think of stories that I've heard even the last few years at Pagos working with customers. There's one that sticks out where, and that some of your listeners might be familiar with this, stop all recurring or the Visa stop payment services, and some of the companies that are out there that are allowing customers to actually stop their subscriptions on the issuing bank side or within the app. Neobanks, that's a new decline code. And that's a new service that issuers have started offering. It's become very popular in Europe. But that is like a new, and I remember having a conversation with a very large merchant who had built they had invested in that infrastructure we were talking about. And it seemed like everything was running. But here was a new decline code that out of necessity, the payment processor had just mapped generically because they didn't want to break everybody's integration. But what was hiding in there was actually the stop recurring decline, which is a block. And so they were trying to understand which banks which customers were actually blocking them on the issuer side, because that changes the way they have to outreach to those customers. It changes maybe even the retry strategy. There's no point in retrying a stop transaction because it's blocked. At the end of the day, one of the key problems is code mappings change and are often inconsistent, and that creates challenges that result in not just declines, but even and not even just waste in terms of like needlessly retrying, but actually kind of customer issues where a merchant's trying to reach out, or they should be trying to reach out and say, "Hey, you blocked us. Let's talk." Right. And so that kind of those kinds of mapping changes are very common in kind of payments data. And I would say so. And related to that is, as the standards change, what do these things mean, and what can we do about it? So I think there's also that added layer that a lot of this is done in almost a technical way, but the business is trying to understand what actions they can take. So I think data and the data models are often static. They get out of date. They're not maintained. A lot of payment teams are inheriting infrastructure, and then therefore they can't really actually execute their optimization, or in some cases their operations.
Yeah, this decline code problem, it's actually so frustrating, right? That there is no some kind of like standard or process or framework. I think it happens every time that payment service provider just maps something and merchants have to deal with this and they're not receiving real insights.
And I think a decline code is actually a message the issuers they're trying to signal, and they're trying to maintain their relationship with the cardholders and everything. All of that, the issuers are trying to do the right thing for their cardholders. Merchants are trying to do the right thing. I think the interesting thing is that when they get wrong, you're not really communicating with the customer what's happening. It creates more challenges and frustration, right? Even trying to be accurate and updated in all aspects of like all the aspects on a payment transaction, all the attributes, like being accurate. What was it flagged as? Did it have CVV? All these things help you understand churn much better. They help you make sure that your investments in acquiring customers are delivering, right? All these things are linked. As you're trying to drive more traffic, you want that to result in revenue, and ultimately payments problems or misunderstandings are attacks on that flow for businesses. So at least we try to make that data, of course, usable. We add more context. Like another example is like MasterCard added advice codes. They may not be the only signal a business uses to make a decision, but they are certainly a signal. Do you even see them? Right? Are you able to use them, or are they buried somewhere in a technical response? So there's things like that. The accessibility to data is often also a challenge for businesses.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Maybe from broader level, from the payment analysis, considering like if the data is there, who do you think owns it and payment analysis on the merchant side? Because it feels like this kind of like very shared responsibility. Sometimes it's like tech team, as you mentioned, right? So they own the integration, right? It can be data engineering or having it in a database. It feels like there is no kind of like a single owner, which makes it a little complex. In your experience, who do you think owns the payments analysis process?
I mean, I think we run into, I'll speak from the users that we see. So I think we see kind of engineering, we see product people, we see kind of operations, we see finance, and in some cases compliance, maybe even strategy. So there's 5 different personas, but every one of them has a different time horizon and a different use, different goal, but all of it is kind of anchored in kind of payments data. We at Pagos like to say that we want to take payments data and make it a first-class citizen in the analytics environment of a business. And we like to think how we try and think about it. How do we help these users being equipped with the data to do their jobs, and being able to understand what's influencing it, being able to forecast it, and also what's changing, projects of a business. I think product managers are trying to should be at the table, deal with operate with payments optimization, or even deliver payments projects that increase revenue. I think there's a few companies we work with where the payments team is actually responsible for revenue. So product managers But who owns it is who owns the logistics data or who owns the revenue data. I think payments data is an asset for a company, and multiple teams should be able to join that back in to their perspectives that they're building. Of course, so yeah, who owns it? The company owns it. I think that
Yeah.
probably the engineering teams are responsible for collecting it, and then a bunch of teams are trying to make it usable. It is a challenge, right? Because of the different needs from each group, serving that in one single way is what I think a lot of companies struggle with, right? You have access problems or problems that come from that. So it always, in my experience, it always starts with engineering though, because they're usually tasked with build the payment connection. Does it work? And for that, they need to know that the flow is there. They'll connect it to something to try and track it. And then the after effect of that is everybody else starts to say, well, how many transactions did we do today? It's like, well, I didn't make that log accessible to you. Those are some of the things that we see happen. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it makes total sense from the like owning the data. Maybe another way to look into this is to see what role and department can make like the biggest impact on the company, like on the company performance, right? Like by
Yeah.
using payments data and payments analysis.
Yeah. I think we see, so I think the biggest impacts we see are coming from the finance teams trying to understand cost. And payments cost is a multi-level challenge for companies, I think, because getting the data and understanding the data often is a blocker. And then, of course, making the data usable for a workflow, I think, is another challenge. So there's like layers of challenge for that to work well. I think it's the reality that payments, especially payment card processing, and if you're global, it varies even more. It's just challenging. It's not impossible, so I don't want to scare people. The reporting is quite complicated because that's the beauty of what the networks have created. On the other side, we see a lot of teams, I think two other teams that are very active. You have chargeback and fraud teams that want to manage that tightly, looking at win rates. Win rates can change. That can have a material impact. So I think we see companies kind of benchmarking chargeback win rates. And of course, you want to see chargeback patterns. So those we are very active in trying to help chargeback teams. The fraud teams, any available data to understand how the fraud is moving, where it's happening, and if the rules are working. So we see a lot of kind of thinking around, does the rule set I have actually achieve the goal? It could be, of course, that it's blocking too many transactions, which is one challenge, but it could also be producing a lot of chargebacks. And then, of course, the revenue optimization or churn side. Payment problems and friction can, of course, impact revenue, not just in the form of cost, but in badly performing payment processing. That could be self-inflicted. We see teams really wanting to know, like, hey, the engineers pushed a release, they're no longer sending zip codes, or the CVV is being dropped. That may not be a good thing in all markets. These kinds of things have impact. But also on the churn side, I think being efficient about retrying, understand where it's happening and where it's different, I think is how the revenue teams think about it. How do we understand where things are breaking down and create targeted strategies? It could be, hey, debit, US, insufficient funds, that's a challenge. What do we see? How are the different banks different? How is our AOV different? These kinds of things help them target how they're going to work. So
Your answer to this question raised another question in my head, because when I'm thinking about solution like Pagos, right, I'm opening the website and I see beautiful dashboards and analysis and trends. So in my head, it's more like the product itself is a visualization of the payments data and understanding the trends, right? What you're also saying that the data itself, kind of like the structured data and reliable data, is also the product, right?
that's right.
That businesses can use and pull into their system to build reporting, even financial reporting, relying on this analysis data. Is this the case? And it's more like basically you have two kinds of products, like visualization and the data stream that merchants
That's right.
can use and to pull in their systems. And basically for them, it's kind of like the challenge to have this structured data themselves, right? Because they need to know all of this, like, as you mentioned, like merchant advice codes, right? So they need to add a new column in their database and start tracking this.
Yep.
When they're relying on you, they have this data ready.
Yeah, and I think that's actually so. I think this is the seduction of, and actually in a way, the dashboard is the product of a
Mm-hmm.
platform. I think that's what we like to say. Some of our customers really see the product as being the platform because by working on the payments data, we have the opportunity to both, of course, standardize it, so normalization, kind of a harmonization, so you can start to compare different things like at issuing bank names. That's a plague for many merchants, and they spend a lot of time. Like we as a default, as the data is flowing through our platform and our
Mm-hmm.
engine, those kinds of things get cleaned up. I think that core ability, and then we try enrichment. When we say enrichment, that is about what we know as payment experts from having seen all this data over the many years of of talent in the company. What can we add that makes using this more easier? It could
Mm-hmm.
be groupings, it can be labels, it can just be as simple as you said, decline code. That is not something that you get out of the box from just looking at the data. It takes some work. So that is the core platform that we build on to provide the visualization and the
Mm-hmm.
alerting. Users want a performant ability to do research without opening a ticket or writing SQL, and they need to do that quickly. We have many customers who use us. Product teams are trying to launch a new market or a new mid. They use us there, and they know that by using Pagos, that they can focus on the launch as opposed to focusing on all the work it takes to get another set of data available to monitor that launch, if that makes sense. So yes, we are a platform. We do that at scale, and we do that because that is the best, and doing that well is the foundation to do great monitoring, great alerting, and of course, great visualization. But I would say there's even the option to use us in a headless fashion. It's a pain to work with cost data. And we have many customers who do that. At the end of the day, if you want us to schedule a push of data, you can do that. And then we're increasingly using AI to open up the data model. If you're doing agentic, or Gen AI or LLM based things, do you need an MCP access? We have that. We even have our bin service there, and we're always playing with both of those aspects, right? Get the data in a way that has a lens of expertise, which is kind of the visualization, or if you want the data to power more specifically workflows, processes, analysis, or integration into other data streams the company has, then we're happy to do that too. And I think in principle, our role is to be an enabler for merchants to make this data more useful more quickly, because you don't have to do it yourself. That's always been my goal. We know that top performing digital businesses, and in some cases retailers or card present or brick and mortar,
Mm-hmm.
take this data very seriously.
Yeah, that may be a good segue to another topic. When you're talking about big merchants, there are a lot of like typical merchants selling on Shopify, but there are so many other like more complex cases. In my head, there are three big examples. Like, of course, there is like a big group of subscription merchants, so they have their like special needs, right, with the renewal payments. There are like marketplaces, and they have two parts, right, of like buyers and sellers. So they
Mm-hmm.
may be interested in additional steps in the funnel. And maybe there are sale assisted flows, right? When there is like maybe like a person helping to the customer to complete their purchase, maybe more like on a B2B side. Um, and of course, there are like way more of examples like this. So when merchant builds this like payments analysis is part of their overall kind of like business analysis, and they have so much kind of like additional steps, and they have so much more context that they can just use in the same tables, right, when they use payments. So they can build kind of like better connection between their like business and the payments. And solutions like Pagos or any other like external tool, it feels external that you need to marry with your data, right? Or bring it. And maybe it will be like, here I have like all my business and here I have payments. And there will be problems that I need to switch between two tabs to have a comprehensive view.
That's right. It is a good segue because I think the philosophy we have of having both out of the box visualization and alerting, some of the greatest customers we have see Pagos as the data source for payments data because
Mm-hmm.
they want to rely on a good, clean set of payments data when they do that join back into their projects and business analytics work. That they, of course, you're right, that companies at the end of the day will have data sets that may never leave the company, but what we see is that often the payments data never gets there because there's so much concern
Mm.
around quality and understanding, right? So I think for companies that are looking for a data set that they can trust and that is kind of managed for them and where people come to work every day and they don't have to spend the resources on it, we do. We play that role of kind of being a provider, and it can be as simple as I guess I'm stuck on the cost example, but that's one that's very common for our customers. When you're doing business analytics and you need payments data, even the ability to understand in cost data what you can do something about and what you can't do something about requires a company like Pagos or the expertise to start to say, this is interchange, this is, a network fee, and this is what you negotiated with
Mm.
your processor. I don't see that as an easy problem for many companies. So what they end up doing is being less precise and kind of saying, well, this is what we're paying for payments. So that's an example of kind of a join that we
Yeah.
can really make much more powerful so that when you're seeing the cost per acquired customer, you understand the influence of the payment method. You can understand what you might be able to do about it.
Mm.
I would say as well, though, there's also a flow that goes the other way, which is that we are trying to take a merchant's perspective on one of the most important processes that they do, which is the payment funnel optimization. And I
Mm-hmm.
think you need to make that easy. I think you can start with payments data, but I think we also have built the platform to allow data to be pushed back, or that enrichment process or context to be shared back with us, so that as an engine of doing optimization or understanding the flow of a checkout, you can, within Pagos, you can see, here were the customers that came from this campaign, here were the customers that came
Mm.
from this effort or this test. So ultimately, the more you tell us, the more we help you find opportunities, which even just looking at PSP reporting wouldn't pop out, because PSPs are about providing payment transaction process. I think we're really trying to take the merchant perspective. How does that fit into kind of the optimization problem of getting a customer that you've acquired to pay, and what's happening along the way? That's your context. What gateway? What campaign? All these steps are needed. So, I think we make it easy for customers to track that.
Mm-hmm.
People get started always with payments data fundamentally, but then they immediately realize, oh, I am running an experiment, or I am trying to target a new customer class, and I'm running this. I need to be able to see that in the payments context. So let's actually add that event or that data label so that
Mm.
I can do that much more quickly and easily within Pagos.
I think I see what you're saying. Without reliable payments data, merchants are usually they're not building themselves to analyze payments and to see details, decline codes or analysis. They see just a high level picture and they see that, hey, these orders, they're not being paid. And that's it.
That's right.
But what you bring is, hey, they're not being paid by these following reasons, and you can slice and dice this data really in the details.
That's right. And I think one of the examples, we had a customer actually a couple of years ago now who they were really looking at this payment funnel. They were looking at, how much revenue were they actually keeping at the end of their kind of customer
Mhm.
acquisition and payment journey. They were actually And they realized with Pagos, even on a single PSP, you would imagine that, but what ended up happening is it didn't. And so I remember we were working with the payments team and they realized, they were able to say, okay, what kind of declines are happening? What banks or what card types were driving that? They realized they were really being abused. And again, for those of us in the industry, it feels obvious, but they were really having an issue with abuse of prepaid cards. And so that conclusion, that understanding of like, yes, we think our revenue every month is at 100, but at the 60 days later, it's actually not, because these customers never have a successful recurring payment, or were resulting in kind of chargebacks or some kind of failure. They were able to kind of see that full picture, and then they started to make changes earlier in the checkout process to say, you know what, maybe for some of these banks we need to be much more careful. Maybe people should prepay, right, as opposed to post pay on some of our offers. And maybe some of the prepaid cards are not worth taking a risk on. And what ends up happening is that tax of like kind of a chaos where you think you're making 100, but you're only making 45 at the end of it. And now you're really talking about revenue, and the finance teams are happy because you said it was 45 and it is 45. It's not 100 and then 50 2 weeks later. Like those kinds of dynamics are really and it has full funnel impact, because all of that can result in customer service things. You're probably spending money to those companies that are trying to email your customers. Like all of these costs start to add up when it's not really aligned. So that's an example of where there's a difference in the perspective we take to try and help, and really that merchant perspective, or we can take a platform perspective too for some of our customers, but that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned really struck me. You mentioned that even on the single PSP, because I definitely see the value of the platform when I have a multi-payment service provider architecture and normalizing between like 2 or 3 or even more providers. That's definitely a challenge. But when you have like a single payment service provider, like a modern one like Stripe or Adyen or Checkout.com, they have dashboards and reporting, so that can satisfy a lot of needs from the data perspective for merchants. Do you still see the value in like normalizing the data, or basically, like to ask this question different way, what are other capabilities or business value you can provide to merchants who are on single?
We have a lot of customers that only have one PSP. So we see that we're delivering value because of kind of that reality that people still struggle. I think if we start kind of, and I'm maybe repeating, I think if we start from like the focus of a PSP and a payment company and the focus of Pagos is really about how do we make a data set useful for a merchant or a payment, like even a fintech. We have some of those platform players as well, but how do we make the payment data useful? I think the way we do that is by taking, I always use the term join because I think of it that way. There's expertise and there's kind of context that is required to make payment data useful. PSP's roles, their first job to make sure the transactions are processing, and you need to keep that dial tone up. They're definitely giving you the visibility on what's happening on the platform, but to translate that, you need to start to ask a different question. So maybe an example is like deduplication, doing that for business context versus just the transactions. We treat that very important. You can apply deduplication operations on your data. So when you look at your approval rate, it is a measure of the way you're retrying transactions. You can get a sense of that final approval rate. In almost every PSP, their job is to, and it's important, you need to see that every single transaction and every attempt was there. But those are two very different sides of that. And it's a lot of work to take that raw data, even on a single PSP, and say, my interchange cost was X this month, or go to the business and say, my approval
Mhm.
rate is actually 98 because our retry strategy is successful. And as we execute that, it's actually doing well. Those are two very different problems. Like we were just talking about, being able to articulate that a campaign or a part of
Mhm.
your business has done better requires a tool and requires data manipulation that answers the question, not that the transactions were processed, but that these
Yeah.
specific transactions actually resulted in incremental, right? And we see that, you can add a payment method. You can do a lot of operations, but understanding that's actually having a business impact or the cost of it is a harder problem that requires that kind of expertise. So I guess, we do see, and it's really about trying to deliver that expertise along with the data so that the users
Mhm.
more quickly get to the answers that they want. And I would say more quickly can be present in the business optimization discussions, of which payments can be a really big driver. That's the thing. We believe at
Yeah.
Pagos that for the big line item that it is in a company, people can use it as a way of moving metrics. And there's usually things that are tweakable. So we try and make that clear. So.
So far, we talked about payment analysis. Let's talk a little bit more about payments monitoring. And I don't even think that many people even like distinguishing between these two. For them, it's just like payments data. I think there are like quite a different components. And I think even in your system, it's two different products. So when you enable payments monitoring, maybe like real time insights for your merchants, what problems do they usually identify, or what are the most common problems? Yeah, you can identify with monitoring.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a good question. Monitoring is something that's been near and dear to my heart because I've been on the other side of the table of being on the vendor side, but also trying to support merchants and what they're trying to do. I would say people, even to my surprise, less people are actually monitoring payments from kind of a business perspective to kind of drive outcomes than I expected. And I think we've spent a lot more time, we've realized, and this is something I've realized, is that people don't actually have a good sense on how to even start monitoring. So one of the
Hmm.
things, when you ask the question about what are people actually trying to detect or what are the different kinds of monitoring, it's actually interesting that like how many are actually monitoring payments in the first place. I think a lot of the state of the art of payments monitoring is a PSP up or down, and I think we think of that as being not enough. And I think we even talked about that earlier. I think we think of that as not being enough to actually help payments teams and businesses actually understand. So that kind of leads in. So what are the kind of top things people are looking for? I think number one, people are trying to understand what their teams are doing and changing, which is an interesting one. It's not
Hmm.
always about the PFP or the acquire. It's often what your own organization is changing, and the checkout process involves a lot of different steps. And so trying to help customers understand those steps and transaction, even something as simple as, did the transactions this hour match what you would expect for your business, is actually a really interesting thing to track, because a lot of times internal changes will impact that number just as much as an issuer going offline or your PSP having problems. So I think one area is monitoring your own business and your own changes. So we see every business is changing and developing and testing new parts of the checkout, but that impacts the performance. And so the monitoring of kind of the operational side is important. Number two, of course, there's vendor management kind of
Hmm.
detection. So I would say, yes, you want to know if a third party that you're depending on has gone down. That often will express itself in the payments metrics, approval rate, transaction, refunds. All these things are also driven by those dependencies. And I would say then there's kind of the business side of monitoring, which is like, are things running but changing. And I think we think of that as kind of the alerting around degradation and change that can be more subtle than a technical outage. And sometimes a card brand or a particular segment of your business goes down. And for that, that just helps teams triage quickly where they should spend their time. So I think of alerting or I think of monitoring as actually when I come to work, what should I focus on? If a learning system is working, the way we think about a good learning system is that your day actually gets prioritized a little bit by being able to review what doesn't look right. It may not be an alarm, but it may be something where you want to focus on. And we actually talked to a company a little while ago where the gentleman that I was speaking to, he kind of runs payments across 15, I think it was across 15 markets. And like you mentioned, the link between the data and the monitoring was very apparent. He basically said, I have some data, it gets to me slowly. So even if I get a report around performance, even in a very granular way, like at a bin level or an issuer level for every market, it takes several weeks and months to get it. So by the time I see the number, the time has passed. And his other challenge is he has 15 things to look at across multiple metrics, across multiple complexity in the data. So that's kind of been always the rallying call for payments monitoring is how do we help people who have that kind of responsibility actually get some help when they come to work every day. And so, yeah, again, monitoring yourself, monitoring your vendors, and monitoring subtle change is, of course, the things that we are trying to make easier. And whether that's a risk metric like chargebacks or whether it's like a revenue metric, those kinds of things are really what we're focused on. So,
yeah, on your last point, you mentioned like a lot of different markets, and also you mentioned like some other ways how you can slice the data, right? It can be like card network, issuer bin. There could be a lot of other kind of like filters, right? Region or maybe platform. So basically, if I'll be doing this manually, I need to identify all these parameters and build all these dashboards, but also I'm also interested in intersection between these parameters, right? Like how these card networks operate in these markets on these platforms. So it becomes kind of like thousands of actually like dashboards.
That's right.
that I need to check. How do you solve this problem? Because if I'll be doing it manually, it will be like not possible. So I'll just prioritize maybe it and create like 10 dashboards.
It's actually one of the things that I actually, when we started Pagos like 4 years ago, I actually was like you. I think I kind of came to the problem of believing that the market and the people in payments would have strong opinions about that problem. Like, oh, well, no, for my business, these are the 1,000 segments I need to track. When these are not. But actually what we have built is actually there's actually two parts to the alerting system. It's actually, we call it kind of segment selection is actually a big part that it's almost the auto configuration of what you look at across all those fragments of your data or not fragments, but segments of your data is actually what we spend, every day. The system is saying, okay, I see all your data. We of course know what is influencing the performance, right? I think, like you mentioned, markets matter, mids matter, card brands matter. So we know that, and then we can see where most of your volume is, and then so we basically select based on the actual distribution of your data across all these key segments, the things you should look at. And because the machines are doing it, like you say, if you were doing it, the intuition is very similar. You come in every morning, you start to drill down. Okay, this processor looks okay, but is this countries okay? Are these mids okay? So there's a little bit of that kind of, that intuition is exactly what it's doing. It's just doing it at scale. So we combine segment selection with the modeling of every customer's business across those segments so that we can understand what's normal. And that's really where the focus for us is, that when you start, when I think the biggest challenge customers have with monitoring is how do you start? Because setting those baselines across all that granularity is actually quite intimidating, and it's actually very tedious. And I think what a lot of companies do is they fall back on kind of, oh, well, this looks about right for all of these, hundreds of segments, when in reality, they're a little bit different. So we actually have tried to
Mhm.
bring a lot of the kind of machine learning that we do. And, at the end, AI is kind of spent not just in the modeling of what's normal for your business, but actually in the segment selection.
Let's maybe talk about anomaly detection. If you're doing things manually, you're identifying what's what's normal for you. As you said, normal is different in different regions,
Yep,
in different platforms. Maybe success rate in the United States, 90-95%, and like in Latin America is way lower. So you need to define this threshold if you're doing it manually. Um,
that's right.
but if you want to, again, to do it in scale, what's the best way to implement this? Let's say if it goes down, because I can't just specify the threshold, right? If it goes below 90%, alert me, because in some
Yeah.
places it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what's the best way to implement this? And if you have an example when anomaly detection actually identified something really interesting.
Yeah, I think the best way to implement it is the way we do it is we think about it by metric. So I think and we think about it by customer. So we have enough of a generic framework. So to incorporate what is unique about each customer and even at that like segment level, and then what is unique about the way these metrics work. And that allows us to come up with approaches that are bespoke to those two things or those two concepts, because I think you're right. And then we're building a model based on those parameters. You cannot use the same approach for chargeback count as you can with transactions, or as the way even approval rate. And then different merchants have different normals that we then calibrate ourselves against. We have, I guess you can almost call them filters, so that we try and avoid corner cases. There are always challenges on the margin, but we are balancing noise versus quality. And we think we found a really good spot there for people to feel confident that when they get an alert, it's something they should look at as opposed to ignore. So that's really, and I guess that's a little bit of the magic sauce of what the team is doing every day, is really evaluating and testing. Okay, approval rate, it feels, of course, we can start and test ourselves against what you're describing.
Mhm.
Okay, if it goes below 90, something's wrong. In many cases, I'll be honest, in some segments, really big markets, maybe that's good enough because your
Okay.
payments data is really boring. But when things
Mhm.
get more nuanced, then we're always kind of testing ourselves against what's the naive, simple thing. Is that good enough? If it's not, how do we layer in a little bit more complexity to handle what's actually happening in your business, what's actually happening in your kind of pattern, to try and detect what's different? I think the examples of where we've been really excited for our customers is actually we've you imagine fraud vendors that are stopping fraud have built great models to stop fraud. I think the challenge with that is they just are as they should be. They're focused on stopping it. What I have been surprised, even though I've been in the industry a long time, is actually the way getting the information about a bin attack, even if your fraud vendor ended up stopping it, is actually an interesting place where merchants are and fraud teams really need visibility. So that's the one which I was not expecting in a way, but like we have built a model that detects bin spikes at a more granular level,
Mhm.
because it's not just about stopping, it's actually about the fact that it happened. I need to know all the bins where a spike happened so that I can evaluate my fraud rules and my setup so that I can understand if things are moving around. So that's a kind of interesting monitoring. It's not so much, hey, is the approval rate down? It's actually saying, hey, these bins have just popped up. What have we missed in the approach that we've had today, for dealing with the movement of the fraud? And that means, hey, my rules need to go and change. So I think those are the ones that are super interesting, because the teams that are really responsible for that are kind of still, I mean, it's always a struggle, but I think we're really trying to help them do a great job. And then, of course, The other examples is the subscription businesses are like clockwork. They expect transactions, revenue, approval rates to stay relatively
Mhm.
stable. And we see a lot of it could be, I think we talked about it earlier too. The recent one was like when the transaction count falls, that's sometimes due to your own changes or your own vendor changes even. And helping companies catch those types of things reduces the delay on revenue at a minimum, and the potential customer kind of support problems. So that's something that I also think is quite cool. And then yeah, we catch chargeback problems, and I think maybe the more common ones are also there as well, but those are the two that kind of stand out.
So you have a lot of data, right, from your merchants.
Mhm.
I'm even a little bit jealous that you can dive deep into this. I'm curious about maybe some interesting trends that you're seeing. One of the trends I'm particularly interested is about alternative payment methods, and if you see how like the card data and like monitoring for cards, right, different comparing to alternative payment methods in the US, and maybe I consider like ACH as a alternative payment method, and
Yeah,
also
yeah.
maybe like Apple Pay, Google Pay, PayPal, and other wallets. So, do you have any insights on that? On do you see in general these kind of like traditional or emerging payment methods they perform differently, or do you see any shifts in this space?
Yeah, in a way, yeah, it's probably in the work that we're doing to do benchmarking. So I know maybe jumping a little bit to adjacent
Mhm.
topic, but I think, and we do see, I think the things that are most interesting are in the US specifically, there's a lot of strength in some of the wallets, the likes of PayPal and things like that continue to be quite strong. The performance of the mobile wallets of like Apple and Google tend to also be very strong. So when you look at and when you're even monitoring, let's say Apple Pay versus almost anything else, the expectations is, and it is true that it tends to perform from an approval rate perspective much, much
Mhm.
better. It's buy now, pay later has been one where I would say from a mix, a lot of people are testing. And I think we see when we look at, and I think we've even posted a little bit of this on LinkedIn, when we zoom out and we look at what we see across the platform, I think we do see buy now pay later is a hot topic in general as a kind of enabler for larger tickets, and we do see that, right? It has its place, and it does drive higher ticket sizes. It actually, on some companies, you see the trends as it increasing in share. It is seasonal. You catch the Christmas shopping season. As always, there's this kind of ramp up of buy now pay later, and of course with the retailers and things like that, it can be quite a good enabler for sales, and we do see it. So I think in terms of testing, in terms of what we don't see, is maybe what's interesting is I don't think we don't see that much crypto. And I guess that's not, there's a lot of discussion around stable coins, and that's much more on
Mhm.
the settlement side,
Yeah.
so we wouldn't necessarily see that from consumers. But even though we're working with every PSP that has these businesses, we don't see a lot of crypto. And I think ACH, I think the trend continues that pay by bank, if I maybe not just ACH, but just pay by bank in
Mhm.
general, I think a lot of companies are testing it. I still, my impression from the companies and the data we see is that it's still a long road, because changing consumer behavior in many cases has to be incentivized in a place like the US, because so much of your business is probably repeat customers. Even if you're doing kind of one time type of
Mhm.
transactions, a lot of those people will be people who are not net new, and we've all been trained to pay with card in wallets basically. And so then that change, it really comes with some push. But do businesses want to? Absolutely. And so we do see enablement. I think some of the new PSPs, I'm wondering if I should mention them, but I guess yes, we see increases in some of the efforts by Stripe to get
Mhm.
into paying, having their own wallet. And
Yeah.
when they push it, it can take some share. So yeah, that's probably in the US what we see. And
Mhm.
yeah, generally you're right as well. From an alerting monitoring perspective, the failure rates, the volume's much lower, right?
Mhm.
And the failure rates are very different for some of those because just by there could be yeah, they tend to fail very differently. I would say the one that customers ask themselves the most for alternative forms of payment method is because most of them require some kind of authentication. Is that
Mhm.
authentication step successful? And that's a very nuanced thing. Cannibalization, tracking cannibalization. If you are tracking customer identifiers across payment methods, you can start to get a sense, are these customers new? Or are you moving them to a new payment method? That's a big question that I think people are doing. And then, of course, and then the side related question is, are these incremental dollars or am I just moving things around? And even if it's cheaper, is it actually cheaper from an operational perspective? Those are things that businesses and merchants are struggling with, and where they want the data, right? They want to understand, hey, okay, our share of checkout moved. Was this additional cost, or in some cases, buy now, pay later, it could be more expensive. Did it actually pay off? And then in other cases, okay, we were forcing people to move, or we're incentivizing people to move to ACH or pay by bank. Is that actually working, or are we having attrition? Some of those things are what I know for a fact merchants are looking at.
Yeah, these are all great questions, and I had them all in my career as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, the lack of data definitely doesn't help.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about AI a little bit. I think there is very interesting picture in the market, right? Because AI in general and like machine learning was kind of like the tools that they're using this technology, they were not like forever, but they were for decades, right? That people were
Yeah.
using AI for like retry logic or even like a neural network for anti-fraud. But I feel like
Yep.
now with LLMs and with ChatGPT, everybody starts talking about this again. And many companies, they're like, yeah, look, we're doing AI too, but they are doing maybe not like LLM, which is the what's hot these days, but they're still doing kind of
Yeah.
like the AI, more like the traditional machine learning,
Yep.
which is like, there is nothing wrong about it. But I feel like these LLMs, they're giving kind of like a fresh air and to push to start having these conversations again. And when we talk
Yep.
about payments, I see that there is the application for LLM, it's quite limited, right? Because payments is a transactional product. So you have like records in a database. So you don't need to get something to generate for you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
To generate a copy or some work. Maybe there are some exceptions. So how do you see this LLM type of AI in payments specifically?
Yeah. Yeah. I've been a big, but it's funny because like we started Pagos, what, over 4 years ago. We
Mhm.
had the AI focus back then. And because using data to make better decisions has always been one of the applications. So I smile. It's a great time to be in the industry for that reason, because I think
Mhm.
finally some of the tooling is so accessible now to the team and everybody's thinking about it. But yeah, I think there's three, maybe the way I think about AI and payments. I think there's a side of AI that Visa, MasterCard, the LLM big players, OpenAI, Perplexity, Claude, these companies are thinking about AI and payments, or AI and commerce, primarily from the consumer side,
Mhm.
which is interesting. But that AI, that agentic commerce, from a, like you
Mhm.
say, from a payments perspective, agentic commerce ends up being just transactions with more and interesting data labels on them. It's, oh, this transaction for this merchant came from an automated buying experience or an agentic buying experience. So you're right. From the transactional side, less interesting. From the consumer side, the AI side on agentic commerce is quite interesting, and there's a lot of questions. What aspects of shopping do you and I think we will give to our automated shopping and agentic agents? I think that's the big question. Certainly, OpenAI, all of these players are definitely interested in creating a shopping experience inside the chat, because exploring inventory, exploring and finding things is shifting now from maybe the traditional search box to more of a discussion with your agent. So I think, I don't know if I'm really an expert on that, but certainly enabling that is going to be interesting and probably changes a part of shopping. I certainly think about, I see my children, there are some things they love to shop with, and that's literally the
Mhm.
exercise of scrolling and looking and almost talking with their friends about shopping. There's also the kind of shopping that's kind of repeat and not interesting, or less.
Yeah.
You need help, right? Maybe travel is one of the great use cases. Maybe booking tickets is for events also, but some shopping will probably still stay as an activity that we enjoy. So I don't know. Now, so then, yeah. So I think businesses are thinking about agentic and AI commerce as that, and I
Mhm.
think since we really focus on the merchant experience, we're thinking about how do we help. It's a channel, right? In that case, how do we help merchants identify and understand that channel across all of the surface area which they're selling against? And we think, because we're a data first kind of platform, I think it's easy to imagine that identifying or adding that label, or capturing that it is an agent, becomes just a data labeling problem. And I think we'll always be helping merchants do that. What is AI? I think I break it into two groups, which really comes from the help of actually talking with my team. So I have to give them credit for helping even me think about this. But there's math that is done at scale, which is AI machine learning, which I think we've been doing for years. And I think that will continue. And that's where you need precision, predictability. I think the Gen AI or the LLM AI, what does it help? It actually helps take the output from traditional AI machine learning and make it easier to consume. So that's how we think about it. Generative AI is about taking, like you mentioned, thousands of alerts and summarizing, or it's about taking a readout of many charts and actually summarizing. So that, and
Mhm.
when you do that summarization step, you have the opportunity to bring expertise and context and to make it relevant to the business. So in many ways, what I think Gen AI will mean for payments is that all of a sudden, that the tasks that you and I may have done 10 years ago manually, or even looking at all of the alerts you get, or all of the
Mhm.
charts, all of a sudden you get some help to say, you know what? Okay, you had 10 charts, actually only 5 are relevant and 3 of them have something meaningful. The reason the Gen AI can help you there is because it remembers, or it can be given context about what's really important to you. PSPs will dump data. Are they really helping you understand what's cross border or not?
Mhm.
No. So that's an example of Gen AI actually makes that step really much easier now, because that kind of context, those words associated with data, become much more usable in a way that I think is very exciting. So that's how we think about it. Context and expertise with data, that's the opportunity. And that's what we're seeing users now start to interact with our tools through some of these interfaces. That's where they start to get excited. It's, oh, I can actually ask a question and bring some context and get some expertise. And then the last thing I will say, which is, so one, it's agentic. Two, there's AI ML and AI generative AI. And then I would say, of
Mhm.
course, from a team and an engineering perspective, I think LLMs, because programming is language, LLMs are, of course, useful for all of us who are writing code. It just is. It's very well suited to that, and we see an explosion in that. That's always internal to most companies, I think. But I think we mappings, all the work that needs to go into building something really great. Of course, the AI tooling helps these days. So even I'm able to use it. You don't have to remember syntax anymore. You can jump in and
Yeah.
write Python in 2 minutes, right?
On the last one, I was actually thinking about this a lot and recently posted even something on LinkedIn about that. With AI and systems like Pagos, you're like seeing all this data, so you can identify, right, very detailed insights, and maybe some of the insights they can create recommendation to
Yeah,
upgrade the technical integration, right? So something like, hey,
that's right.
like one of the parameters is not included in this like API call, or hey, you're not parsing this from the response. And maybe the system can even talk to the payment orchestration module who are like owning these integrations,
That's
or
right.
if it's like
Yeah,
in-house or maybe external, and this module can automatically actually enable this. And
that's
it's
right.
all happened
Yeah.
without human, right? So we have like fully automated integrations upgrade. Do you think we're there yet? Because I actually didn't see it like in reality. I think it's still human needs to like go between systems, or yeah, or
I don't.
apply this insights. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think we're there. I think we're there yet. In you can, for the first time, you can see that future. So I think you're seeing, and I will say that even with some of our customers, I think they're starting. It's really early. It's very early in that journey, but I think the
Mhm.
possibility that merchants will just own that, and own it, meaning that they'll be driving, or they'll probably, will the agent be, who will have the agent? I think a lot of merchants start to think, I need the agent and it will go tell my systems what to do. So I think that's happening. And I think the experiences you're describing are what people are imagining as well, which is that if the data is saying something, can the action be can the action be taken? I think one, and again, I thank my engineering team because we think about this. The real problem, though, I think, in why it's not a reality is that not everything has an API. It's still the
Yeah.
case where, and as good as Operator and Perplexity and all that, Claude Chrome, as good as these things are, in, in reality, I don't think many vendors have exposed the APIs for these changes to be done in a
Mhm.
scalable way. So you're going to have a very expensive browser wrapper session to go and reconfigure a fraud rule. Like, it's absolutely possible. And again, the cost for everything will fall over time. But is that really, going back to what you said about AI, machine learning, and AI generative, is that really the best use of the resources and the cost to do? Or is
Mhm.
it better that actually the payment vendors and stacks of the world just need to have APIs for everything? And I will call out, that's what, if there's an API to configure your payment system, then absolutely there will be that these systems will be able to bring that context expertise and then push a change. And in the meantime, I'm sure we will see some merchants play, actually, could you log on my behalf to go change something? Absolutely. I think those things are possible, but I think they're still iterating. The other thing I think
Mhm.
that's very exciting, where the action step is being automated, is also in research decision problems, which is not a surprise. Are, let's say you have a bunch of declined orders, or orders, the manual review process in fraud, right? You have a queue.
Mhm.
I think businesses are starting to look at that, where today there are a lot of people looking at it. That's a really great opportunity to actually build an agent that starts to help, get that queue work down faster, that can take in many more data points. So we like to think about, okay, how do we help customers who are doing some of that agentic, targeting some of those workflows? How do we help make sure they have all the data and all the context they need in a way that an LLM can actually use it to help that problem? I think those things will happen, those workflows will happen, but it's still early. But I think it will happen. But I would, again, I'll say the thing that our engineers and always remind me is, yeah, MCP is great, but it is just another API. And if there were more APIs for things, and that sounds very like Web 2.0, if there
Mhm.
were APIs for everything, some of these things could have happened even 5 years ago, because the math is not that hard. Signal is maybe not that hard in a way. It's just that there's no endpoint.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about benchmarking. I would
Yeah.
imagine that a lot of merchants, they are like super interested and super kind of like excited about benchmarking. And I believe the most reason for merchant is just to see that everybody else in their industry kind of like operates on the same level, and they're not
Mhm.
doing anything wrong. So it's more like a comforting feeling for them. That's kind of, hey, I'm not the worst in this area from the payments performance. Is this the kind of like demand or request that you're receiving for benchmarking, or there are any
Yeah, we
other kind of
see.
like insights? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we no, I think we're very excited about benchmarking. I think, and like you say, I think a lot of our customers are excited about it too and starting to play with it. I think there's two types of benchmarking. One, there's what I would say is the insurance or strategic benchmarking side, which I think we think about as, let me take a step back. The benchmarking that we find resonates the most with customers is actually, is it me? So is it me or is it the market? So you're absolutely right that the impulse and the fear or the desire comes from, when you come into work every day, you look at your payment data, you see something's changed. Is it me or is it the market? If it's the market, that's a different discussion than if it's me and I can take an action. So we are definitely trying, in the way we're building the product and giving that capability, we're really trying to help companies answer that question. Is it me or is it the market? There are kind of two types. I think there's the kind of strategic side, which is that, and this I would say is for really large companies, they feel they're doing everything right and they just want an assurance that's true. So, like you say, okay, I'm in a digital subscription space, or I'm a retailer. What is good? What is normal? Am I within a reasonable level for everybody else? And it helps them then prioritize. And again, that word comes out, priorities. When you come to work as a payments team, what should you focus on? You should focus on the areas of your business where you're not at benchmark. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think we help give data that supports that kind of strategic focus, prioritization on where things are not right. There's a level in the strategy bucket too, which is that, what trends are happening as well. So it's not just about the approval rate benchmark, but it's also about, is the share of declines, for example, changing? Because that's an indication, that's a signal into macroeconomics at that point. So if NSF, insufficient fund declines, are increasing over the last 6
Right.
months, is that me? It's the same question. Is it me or is it the market? And if it's the market, then I have to talk to the team about changing our forecast, because it looks like actually there's some pressure on spend. And we've shared some of the things we see actually on LinkedIn, NSF increasing for the first half of 2025 on
Mm-hmm.
debit cards versus credit. So again, those kinds of signals are there, or sorry, those kinds of use cases are there. And there's a lot of interest in getting a third party perspective to try and help contextualize your own performance. And when you're talking to the leaders of your company and you're at the table saying, okay, we're going to optimize the business, where are there opportunities? Benchmarking absolutely helps quantify that. Hey, we look great. So maybe it's a new market versus trying to squeeze an orange that's already been squeezed to optimize something when the whole market is the same, right? I think that requires, I think for some teams, there's another kind of benchmarking, which we're really excited about, which is actually having a broad network and visibility can also be packaged up differently. So the way we have started thinking about it is, what if you could get not a benchmark at a bin level or a bank level, or at different kinds of scores about what the network of customers is seeing in the cohort. Those can be really powerful in use cases that are kind of pre and post transaction. Like, and I think about the use case of virtual cards. It's very hard to establish whether a card is a virtual card or not, but benchmarking actually can help indicate where a bin or a bank might have a higher proportion of some of those behaviors. What is a virtual card behavior? Virtual card behavior is when you have a lot of churn or
Mm-hmm.
unsuccessful recurring payments. So those are kinds of things that we think about are kind of almost a signal that comes from having a benchmark that you can
Hmm.
then integrate into a decision. So we're playing with a lot of that to help companies tune their processing and even their customer relationship. The other one I was thinking about that we were talking with a customer about is, what if many companies block users when there are chargebacks, right? Once there's a chargeback, you block the customer. Or even in the case of churn, once you have an unsuccessful invoice, you start to think about, I'm going to block this customer, I'm going to turn them off. What if through benchmarking, you could get a perspective to say that some of those users or some of those banks are actually highly likely to recover or not so likely to be charged back? Over
Hmm.
time, you may take a different approach, and that's revenue, right? If you don't block the user for a year, but you block them dynamically for a week or 3 months or whatever, then you start to say, oh, actually, I'm keeping a customer and I'm increasing my revenue in a thoughtful, data-driven approach. So those are all the areas that we think about benchmarking, and we're playing with both. And yeah, you have the strategy prioritization problems, and then you have the
Hmm.
what I wonder if I could move a risk metric or a revenue metric by incorporating the benchmark into a decision on whether I give a grace period, whether I shut somebody off, or whether I want to know something about a user when they land on the website. Are they in a bank or in a bin that is likely to be problematic based on what my peers are seeing, right? And so that's very exciting. So we'll see how these things develop. But I think that kind of activation of a benchmark or usefulness of a benchmark is what we're really excited, and what we can do that's quite unique, I think, compared to others. We'll see how it goes.
It's way more complex than I thought. So it's not just like approval rate in the industry. It's again like
Yeah, yeah,
very sliced for so many parameters. Okay,
yeah.
let's maybe zoom out, maybe when like beyond the payments data and the payments performance.
Mhm.
What is the biggest problem in the payments today? And what's the main kind of like blocker for us to start getting kind of like fast, cheap, convenient, secure payments?
The biggest blocker, wow. I think we're focused very much on the merchant side. So I think in many ways so maybe cheap is the big thing in the US, where I think the value that you're paying for payments doesn't always feel there. But I do think a lot of the other aspects are somewhat solved in terms of, cards work. Yes, they can feel expensive, but they do. When you think about the experience that they enable, I think in many cases it's quite successful, and you can transact with the world. But I think, sure, I think the way my children will pay for things will probably be a little bit different. After so many years in the industry, I've probably fallen into the camp that I can't change. Probably the people my age will never change, but
Mm-hmm.
the generations change. So I think the thing to watch in payment trends is really how are the children and the different age groups changing their relationship to money. And then that will probably be what merchants are having to think about. We see a lot more spend control, neobank, alternatives, even buy now, pay later usage in those. They have less money, of course. And I think that drives, so your incremental new customers, you're probably going to have to think about where and how are they thinking about money, and how are they managing their money, and are their payments experiences tied around that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, watch those payment experiences. The other thing I reflect on is the people in the payments industry tend to think very deeply about payments. And I think I don't know if you've had the experience, but I certainly have. When I tell people what I do, they're like, yeah, but it works, right? So what do you mean it's complicated? So I think there's a certain aspect of that too, which is that a lot of people are going to take the lowest friction. You do need to watch the biggest banks and the biggest
Mm-hmm.
brands. How are they training people to pay? I'm not a huge believer. I will be happily corrected in some of the more. I try and favor things for crypto because I'm a payments nerd, but I don't see many people doing that. So I don't know if that change will happen. There are use cases, absolutely, but is that from a
Mhm.
consumer perspective? And then the only other trend is, of course, when regulators get involved,
Mhm.
that causes incentives to change. You look at Europe, you look at Australia, how are they and even in the US, Fed now, these types of RTP, these kinds of things are basically they're big investments to change payments, but
Mhm.
it comes at a huge amount of cost to get people to move. I guess I think about India, they moved a lot of things
Yeah.
electronically. So I think always worth thinking, okay, where are the incentives in the industry moving? Interchange is a very big revenue driver for banks. Are they really interested in changing? It's a question, right?
Mhm.
Of course, regulatory changes will impact that because then they have to do something. So yeah, maybe I think digital payments will continue, but what form? Look at the way kids are consuming commerce experiences. And then I think that will probably be as incrementally, that will be part of
Mhm.
the shift. Um,
Very interesting.
yeah.
Last question. What is the practical advice, like single practical advice you will give to a merchant to improve their payments performance? For example, you met someone like in the elevator, you have 30 seconds together, and they're like, oh, yeah, I'm processing like $1 million a month. How would you recommend me to improve my payment stack?
Yeah, I always ask your approval rate, and that's usually an interesting question because I've heard responses on my approval rate's 100 all the way down to something else, and we've used that as an example of sometimes merchants are only counting their successful transactions and not realizing. So but that's maybe a little bit of a corner case. I think if I'm in the elevator, number one, I think from a revenue side, I think there's unforced errors like the tennis match analogy. I think there's always unforced errors in payments. And if you're not looking at your data from an approval rate and transaction count perspective, very simple metrics, and breaking that down a little bit, then you need to look at that because there's going to be opportunities there to tune something. And I don't think we've met a business doesn't that doesn't benefit from actually be looking at the revenue metrics and making sure that everything is looking good. I like the example is, are there declines that are happening for technical reasons? There shouldn't really be. Of course, there's always going to be some, but what is the proportion of your declines
Mhm.
that are coming from technical? Or the one I always look at is, are your fraud rules too aggressive? And again,
Mhm.
you may have reasons for blocking transactions that are completely valid. So it's not that you're doing that wrong, but it is not something you want to set and forget because things move and you need to look at it. So that's on the revenue side. On the cost side, I think it's, again, are you looking at it? Do you understand your invoice? Because there are addressable, actionable things there. Your payments behavior, how you process transactions, influences your costs and performance. On the cost side, the networks, especially again on the card side, but they are incentivizing good behavior. So
Mhm.
settlement times, retry counts, penalties, integrity fees. These are things that have things you can do about it. You may choose to still do things the way you're doing, but it's always worth taking a look and saying, you know what, I am paying 10,000. I had a merchant who was they were paying $60,000 in integrity fees because of not submitting CVV when they could have. And so they were not qualifying for the best kind of processing. That's a huge tax on a business. That's what, a head count at least in a monthly fee. So start there and then work your way from there. And then every year things change. So keep an eye on it. And then network tokenization, account updater, making sure people's credentials are
Mhm.
your best customers can always pay is always worth doing. And some of the long time streaming platforms have become experts where I've never had to update my card once. I've never had to type my card again on something like Netflix. They always just keep updating, right? And that's a beautiful experience. We never get kicked off. So think about those tools and maximize them and use them intelligently. So yeah, those. I think I probably went up 100 floors on the elevator to talk so long, but yeah, those are the kinds of things I think about.
Albert, thank you so much. It was absolute pleasure to record it with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to the next time. Thank you so much.